So hopefully you all are seeing my screen. Okay, so welcome to the AGUBDI um, Beyond the Academy workshop series. We are now on the third iteration of this series. Today we're talking about NGOs and private research centers, and we have three great panelists here to talk about that. We wanted to remind you about our last workshop that's on private industry that's in mid-November, and you can register for that using this link here. Um, and we'll go ahead and get started. So how this is going to work today is we're going to spend an hour just chatting with our panelists here, and we have questions from you all from your registration. And you're welcome to also put questions in the chat. Lusan here will be monitoring those questions. And then we'll go into breakout rooms where you'll have the chance to speak with each of these panelists individually. Well, not individually, you'll be in groups, but if you have questions about specifically EDF or the UN or Woodwell Climate Center, you can join those specific breakout rooms. And I think that's everything I need to tell you. We are waiting on one more panelist, so we'll just get started with the two panelists that are here right now. And so we'll go ahead and start. I'll let you all introduce yourselves. So let's have Jocelyn go ahead and introduce yourself, say where you're from. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Hopefully this will be a good conversation for folks. So I'm Jocelyn LaValle. I'm a senior scientist at EDF, and my title is an agricultural soil scientist, but I deal mostly with greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural soils. And Environmental Defense Fund is a really big, well, it's not the biggest, but it's quite a large NGO. It's about 1,000 employees, and it's a global organization. So we have offices all over the world. We have, I think, 14 offices in total, but a lot of remote employees like myself. So I work remotely. And the organization in general, our big goal is to help solve climate change. But we also work on things like healthy communities and making sure that there can be a just transition. But pretty much all of our work focuses in one way or another on climate change. Yeah, and so I'm sure I'll get into more of that as we discuss, but that's me.
Or you want to go ahead? Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, I think I was muted on my end. Sorry about that. So I'm Jenny Watts. I am a systems ecologist here at the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Massachusetts. I am also director of our Arctic Research Program and co-founder director of our Rangeland Carbon Program. So everything I do is about carbon, and that's really what we focus on here at Woodwell. So we're a much smaller NGO. We currently have about 160 people working in Massachusetts, and then we have others worldwide, really. And our focus is climate change and the intersection of understanding how humans are impacting climate and ecosystems, and then how that impacts us. So really the sustainability of our planet. We are also, as an NGO, able to focus and invest in fundamental research, but also have that research impact policy, which is really exciting and why I chose to be at Woodwell in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess you're kind of getting into my next question already, Jennifer, which is great. So my next question was going to be, and so yeah, these questions are, as I mentioned, based on your kind of registration questions, but feel free to ask additional questions in the chat. So the first question I have for you all is, what was your career trajectory to your current point, and what was your motivation for following that trajectory? So maybe, Jenny, you can start us off.
Yeah, I always thought I would end up as a professor at a university. And my background is very academic. I was trained as a PhD. I worked a lot on NASA projects, focusing on high latitudes and carbon cycle science. So that included going to the field and instrument design, but really integrating a lot of data through models. I met my postdoc advisor, Sue Natali, who happened to work at Woodwell Climate while I was a PhD student. And something about learning more and more about the NGO sector just really intrigued me. It was an opportunity to focus on the research and still teach, not in a traditional setting where you're in front of hundreds of students, but more one-on-one teaching and training of students and bringing them into research. So it's really through Woodwell, I have an opportunity. So I started out as a postdoc at Woodwell. I chose to stay because I really enjoyed that environment and collaborative research with a focus on impacting, so science for good, science that impacts policy, and still having the opportunity to work with students, including graduate students, undergrads as interns, and playing a role as postdoctoral advisor. So that was something that has been really important to me and the reason why I chose to go down the NGO path in the first place.
Great. Thank you. Jocelyn, would you like to share?
Yeah, that's a great answer, Jenny. I guess it was a little different because I also was a very academic background and similarly kind of always had in my head that I might try to be a professor. But I also always had in my head that I knew there were kind of other things going on. So I had this innate curiosity about other sectors that I think everybody here probably agrees is kind of hard to understand if you're in academia. Um, so I did follow that academic path and did a postdoc. I actually did two postdocs, one of which I transitioned into what we call a research scientist, which is like a soft money research position at Colorado State University. And that's when I really started, I would say, like working with folks in other sectors a little bit through grant writing and working on grants. And I also noticed while I was there that EDF, the organization I'm at now, was funding some work of researchers at CSU. And I always noticed that those projects that they were funding were very cool because they were very applied. They still used basic science concepts and wanted to kind of explore knowledge gaps, but they were always thinking about how this could be applied to impact, have really big impact in the world. And I thought that was pretty cool. So that kind of got me thinking that might be something I was into because it was a great mix of real rigorous science, but application as well. And so, yeah, when this position at EDF came up, I jumped on it and I was pretty excited. Sorry, I see that question. It's Environmental Defense Fund is the name of our organization.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it seems like you both really valued like having a big impact with your research, and it seems like you both found that NGOs were a great way to do that, which I think is great. And maybe related to kind of both of you having this more academic background, could you speak to what skills from your graduate studies or academia were important when applying to your current job, and how do you use those skills now?
I can jump on. So for me in this position, it really helped having background experience in the field and then having that experience with remote sensing and ecosystem modeling and big data analysis. Just as important in the NGO world and my position was early on having during my PhD years, getting experience working on proposals and working in big group collaborative settings where we're all working towards the similar research goals. And that's something that really prepared me for this position where I do work on a lot of proposals all the time. And something I really do enjoy is that team setting, working with multiple groups and pushing the science forward, not just being solo in my own work, my own research. I know that some of us may prefer that, but for me, I really enjoy the team settings.
Yeah, I can jump into. So I agree with Jenny, like all the basic science skills are super important, but the ones I would say I use absolutely the most are probably the skills I learned through teaching, which are really translating the science and distilling things down into something that folks can digest and really, relate to and understand. So I do that constantly every day, even for other scientists at the organization, because we're always talking across our disciplines. So that's really an important skill that I would say teaching was a great way to learn. And if you don't have the opportunity to teach, there are obviously other ways to learn it too, but always thinking about how you can, distill your science down and translate it is super important. And then the other one is reviewing was actually a super duper important skill that I use all the time because we're constantly kind of, well, we're maybe asking for proposals from folks that we have to review. I still review a lot of papers, but we also just have to scrutinize things that we see on a daily basis and kind of understand how to read between the lines and decide, is this rigorous, is it not, and why? Even things that we see from the private sector, we're constantly reviewing. So those are two skills that I think, yeah, come in handy a lot more than I maybe anticipated when I was learning them.
Jocelyn, I'm so glad you mentioned reviewing. Like anyone on this call, start reviewing as soon as possible if you haven't already, because it's really a fantastic experience to see what others are working on, but also to have the opportunity to make that critical assessment to help others improve their research and to push science forward.
Yeah, I think it's actually quite interesting that you all kind of touched on a lot of kind of broad academic skills that I think a lot of people would be nervous wouldn't apply that much to these sectors. And it seems like they do, which I think is probably good news for probably a lot of people here who are pursuing PhDs and aren't sure if that's necessary for their field of work. And maybe kind of related to that, I see there's a question in the chat kind of talking about education level, and maybe you all could speak to the education level that is required for your positions, and then also kind of what what different types of positions are in your organization for people with different education levels. And so maybe Jenny, you can start us off.
So I came in as a PhD and I went through a 2-year postdoc before I transitioned into my position or earlier career version of my position. And the postdoc was really important, I think, in that preparing me for this role because it gives you an opportunity to keep working on your research and focus on it just like you are during a PhD. But then it also is that transitional period where you're learning about leadership skills, how to manage a team, how to lead more proposals, and really the manage your budget. That's really important too. Those are things that you don't necessarily think of while you're doing a PhD, but you very much have to do day to day when you get this scientist role at an NGO. And other opportunities, we have so we're small relative to other NGOs, but we have various roles starting out as undergrads. We host a lot of interns every year to get them in the door and getting that hands-on science experience. We also have research assistant positions, and that's someone coming in with a bachelor's in science typically. And then we bring in a lot of master's students and train them, and often they go on to do PhDs. And then we have many postdocs and more senior research scientists that don't necessarily, or their PhD level, they've gone through a postdoc, but maybe they don't want to go into more management. Maybe they want to stay more on that pure science realm so that there's an opportunity for that too in our organization.
Yeah, we're very similar in that there is a diversity of potential roles, which means that there's kind of a diversity of ideal qualifications. But in general, yeah, to be a high level scientist in the NGO world, I would say it's pretty similar to academia in a lot of ways. You are expected to have a PhD and many years of experience, and at least at EDF, we're promoted along similar lines in terms of how many publications we have, like how well known we are in our field, and those kinds of things are all taken into account. So there's obviously some other, differences and products that might be maybe prioritized in different ways. Like, so white papers are still very important in the ENGO world. But I would say in general, it's pretty similar in terms of education. Yeah.
And something to add too, at our level, when we're promoted, we go through something similar to, I guess, what you would do through academic tenure, where there's portion of that is your center asks your peers to assess you. So you're really vetted as you move up in the science ladder.
Yeah, and just a question about postdoc years, and I would say yes, that is counted as experience for us. I think that's pretty much across the board.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear that there's opportunities kind of at all levels, but it's, yeah, for folks going back to me again, it's not maybe so different than they might expect. And I think something that can give people a lot of insight is if you all can speak to like the day-to-day of your job, like what are the tasks you're doing day to day? Like how do you spend your work time, you know? And so maybe Jocelyn, you can kick us off for this one.
I was curious to hear Jenny's answer, but I will hear it. But a lot of days are pretty different. But if I had to like break it down, I would say it's a pretty even mix of meetings, emails, and focused work. So it's pretty similar probably to a lot of what folks experience now. Those meetings can range from things like one-on-ones, a little bit of mentoring maybe, to large group meetings where we're just kind of trying to understand what's going on across the organization and make sure that all our work is in line with each other. To small group meetings, like I have a smaller team that I work on just on ag soil greenhouse gas emissions, so we meet weekly. A lot of emails going back and forth all the time. That's just life these days. And then focus work is also pretty similar to kind of what I was doing in academia. There's a lot of writing, still data analysis, a lot of reading and reviewing papers. But I would say in my position specifically, there's a bit less, well, a lot less grant writing than there was in my previous position. And probably a lot more of kind of review of other folks' work within the organization, because a lot of my job is to make sure that our science is rigorous and accurate, especially when it's being communicated outside. So like a lot of what the scientists do at EDF is just kind of make sure that everything we're doing is science-based. So that takes time. So there's a lot of that.
Yeah, same for me. Day to day really varies. A lot of days I'll just be at my computer answering emails and trying to work on other things. Other stretches I'll be in the field or traveling for conferences and meetings. And I think if we zoom out over the course of a year, it's probably split between project program management, proposal writing, manuscript writing development, and then when I get lucky, about 35% is just focused research.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful insight and maybe kind of along the lines both of you kind of mentioned grant writing and funding in those answers. And there were some questions about job security in terms of funding for these positions and whether you have sort of base funding or whether you need to fund your own position. And I wonder if you all could speak to that and for yourself and for your organization. So maybe Jenny can kick us off this time.
Yeah, our position, we started out as fully soft money for our NGO, and we're fortunate to be at a point where I'm roughly 50-50. So I have money coming in that I don't need to raise for 50% of my time. And then in addition to that, it's the proposals that I lead or am a part of bringing in additional support. And then also foundation support is a big one for us. So it's not necessarily writing proposals to government organizations, although we do that quite a lot, but having foundation, just that relationship with foundations, and then they know about our work and choose to support it. So it's not that guaranteed tenure track experience that a lot of universities offer. However, we have a lot of benefits that I think that I wouldn't have at many universities, financially and otherwise. And so while it is still partly soft money, I feel it's pretty secure, and I don't have a lot of day-to-day concerns about that.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty similar in terms of, no job is 100% secure. So we always have that in our mind, right? But on a day-to-day basis, it's not something that I really think about. And because EDF is really big, we actually have a whole, department that does our grant writing and maintains those relationships that Jenny was talking about, which is nice because that's not something that the scientists have to do directly most of the time. So we can focus a lot on the work. There is that added element of we have to communicate to the folks who are doing that grant writing and that external relationship management. So like you can't get away from it entirely, and there are pros and cons, I think, to that model as opposed to a smaller NGO. But in general, it's nice to be, I think like Jenny was saying, in an organization that has pretty steady funding. We have a pretty clear motivation, and what we're doing is kind of clear to like the outside funders. So we generally maintain those relationships through time and have a pretty steady funding stream. So yeah, it doesn't feel too insecure, I would say.
Nice. I'm sure that's reassuring for folks to hear. And I think you both kind of spoke this maybe a little bit more so, Jenny. Like a lot of people are kind of questioning, what is the work-life balance? I see a question in the chat about this, of these kinds of positions, and like maybe along those lines, like kind of what are the benefits and drawbacks of your position that you see?
I don't even know what work-life balance means sometimes. I've had a lot of conversation with colleagues and friends about what it means to them. For me, it kind of feels like maybe every day there is not, so I am in a position where I can really define what I do. And so a lot of what I take on is really on me because I say yes, that I want to work on something, and I don't really look at my position as work. I look at it as something I love and something I do. That said, I do need to balance family life and friend life and work life. But it's probably like kind of, it comes and goes just like seasons, right? You have certain periods where you're really focused on different projects, and maybe you have less time to take a vacation or get out with friends. But then others, it really balances in the end, because other times I tend to just put the projects aside and make time for the other things that I love in my life. But overall, I feel like um, it's balanced as long as you love what you're doing and you look forward to it every day.
Yeah, I have a pretty similar experience. I would say it has, for me at least, been more balanced than in my previous position in academia, but I think that's also career, sort of where you are in your career. And I think when you are in earlier stages, like you're hustling a little bit, you need to really get known by other people. You need to get grant money, you need to write papers, you're trying to establish yourself, and that can be very taxing. And I think as you kind of progress, you tend to have more choice in what you take on and what you don't, because hopefully folks know who you are, and might remember you the next time they're thinking of a project. But there's still always that like maintenance in the background, right? So you do need to be cognizant of making sure that you're still relevant, that you're still doing good work, that you have stuff that's going to come up, and you're not going to have like big gaps. So like Jenny said, I think a lot of it is kind of up to you and how you want to play it, if you will. But I will say that just in general, my experience at EDF has been that there is a lot more respect for your time, and I don't answer emails after 5 p.m. and I don't go to meetings outside of 9 to 5 within my time zone. And people are very respectful of that. I can if I want to, but it's not expected. So that part I do really appreciate. And I have felt like it's been easier to say no and kind of have that balance when I want to have it.
And Jocelyn, I think you're right. I think it gets easier as you progress in your career and you move into more senior roles where you feel like you can say no. You're not just working for someone on their project and it's go, go,
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for those insights. A few folks have asked about specifically how much focused research work you can do in these positions, and I think maybe it's probably dependent on what you're doing in the organization, what your role is, and so maybe you all could speak to that. Jenny, if you want to start.
Well, I can tell you truthfully, I don't have those days where I can just focus on code writing and data analysis anymore. I am very much more in a project management role, but I do still have hands-on time with the research and data. It just is something I have to balance into my schedule. I have to make sure that I leave the time for research, which I really love. For me at this point, the project management is really important, but I find that time for research kind of to be very therapeutic, or I can turn off email and I can just focus on the work that I want to do. So it ends up being about, like I said, 35% of my time is pure research, and that includes field work and working with the data coming in and outreach. In addition to that, I have the manuscript development, which is still research, but it's not necessarily like hands-on data analysis. I kind of bin those separately. And then for me, proposal writing is a big part of my life. I still consider that to be within a research bin, because that's me actively developing what my research goals and looking to the future and thinking about how we can push my field forward and what I want to focus on and be a part of. So proposals I really enjoy, and I see the benefits of an organization like EDF where other people are writing proposals for you. I think that's lovely. For me, I personally like having that hands-on time to develop future research and think about how to pull together research teams.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I feel like our breakouts are probably similar, but then what we're doing in that time is maybe a little bit different. But yeah, I have started I would say like viciously guarding my focused work time. I actually like block it off on my calendar, and that's helped a lot because I think my first couple years at EDF, when I was still understanding the organization and what my role was, I did not do that. And so I ended up working a lot of nights and weekends on like papers and things. And so now that I'm a bit more established and kind of understand things and what I can and cannot, say no to, it's been a lot easier to block time off. And I've been pretty good this year about having about half of my time that I have no meetings. I often don't answer emails unless they're very important, and can really dig in. But a lot of it is pretty similar to what Jenny was saying. There's some direct data analysis and things like that, but a lot more of it is writing, reading, those kinds of activities that often go into a manuscript eventually, but maybe I'm not doing as much of that raw data analysis as I used to. But I do still do some of that.
I think a lot of what we're seeing here is time management is crucial, especially if you want to keep that work-life balance or focus on whatever you want your life to look like. It's really, I think, personal. Every person does this differently. But going back to my grad years or even undergrad, I never at that time really understood why professors lock their doors. I was like, wow, they don't want to talk to people. But now I understand you really do, your time that is focused is so precious, and you have so many other things that are being thrown at you. And so it really depends on it's up to you how you schedule things and how you manage your time. And it is important to block out the world so you can focus on things if you want to get it done.
Yeah, and maybe a related question to this about like your research focus time. Someone in the chat is asking about how your organizations set research priorities and how much of your research is kind of based on your organization's research priorities versus your personal research interests. Like, could you all speak to that sort of balance?
Jocelyn,
Maybe
you want to
just
go first?
yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really great question. I would say this is something that we actually keep in our minds quite a lot as scientists at EDF because it is such a big organization. And like I was talking about before, a lot of the folks who are working directly with funders are separate from the scientists. So it's something that we have to revisit all the time and make sure that we're in alignment on that, because obviously we don't want to be researching something that we're not passionate about and experts in. And there's always this sort of balance. I think you have it in academia too, where there's a funding call or a funder has a particular interest, and do you want to respond to that and sort of bend to their will, if you will, and research what they're interested in, or do you want to research what you're interested in? So there is a balance that you have to strike. And on our team, we're pretty lucky in that, the reason I joined this team was because I'm interested in this topic. So there's always going to be that element of like whatever we get will be something that I'm probably interested in. But I do also I'm very lucky to be able to make time for, you know, what I would call my more specific projects. So like I still do a lot of research on fundamental soil organic matter cycling and mechanisms that might not be directly relevant to something that a funder is really interested in, but is still valued here because, like I said, we are supposed to sort of maintain our status as sort of a known scientist in the space and an expert in a field. And so there's that underlying, you know, we're kind of allowed and given that we're given encouragement to keep doing that. So it's a nice balance because some things we are sort of given, we say, you know, we hear, okay, there's a funder that's really interested in this. Is this something that you all could work on? And we'll say yes or no. But then we do have that time to kind of maintain our own research in the background as well.
Yeah, and here at Woodwell Climate, we're still a smaller NGO, although we're growing a lot. And so we have been and still are now very much principal investigator, science-driven research. So we come in with our history of research. What do we specialize in? We've already established a lot of our peer groups, and we have certain focus areas that we personally are interested in. And and then we look for the funding to keep supporting our research, and we keep bringing people in to help us with the research. So we have a lot of lab assistants and research assistants. Um, that said, we are growing to the point where we're having to think about what does the future look like? Is it something that we want to take more of an EDF type model where other people, we have certain focus areas as larger groups within the organization, and then we have maybe grant writers write those proposals for us. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and I really think it depends on how large your organization is and what the structure is like. Um, but I do think that at a lot of organizations, you still have the leeway as a scientist to define your own work.
Yeah, I'm sure that's great for a lot of folks to hear. I think a lot of folks view academia as like where you can be maybe more creative in your research endeavors or something, but it's good to hear that you can have those opportunities in non-academic settings as well. So we have some questions about how you all found your positions and whether you cold applied, whether you knew folks in the organization that you could kind of network with, and then kind of maybe related to that, are there specific resources for these kind of NGO private research center kind of positions? So I mean, Jenny, you can speak to that.
Yeah, I was really fortunate because in a lot of ways this position found me starting as a postdoc. It was through a lot of networking and going to focus science meetings. For me, it was NASA terrestrial ecology. So I really was able to get to know the more senior people in my field and then see them again at conferences and mini workshops. So really having the relationship building, even as a PhD student, put me in a position where there's this opening for a new project, and the person who approached me recognized they knew my skills, they knew my background, and they knew it was a good fit. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have to go out and look, but I think that building your network early on is really beneficial to you, and not necessarily waiting for that job to appear on the internet. You go look for it, talk to people, let them know about you and what you're interested in. And I think that just makes the career transition and finding positions that really are a good fit easier for you in the long run.
I think that's awesome advice. Funnily enough, I did the opposite though. So you'll get the other side of it. But I totally agree that I think there's a lot out there that you might discover, you know, doing what Jenny suggested. So that is really important. But I actually did basically cold apply to my position. I think the position was sent to me by a friend maybe. So I don't think I found it on a job board, but it was definitely making the rounds in the carbon world. And so a couple people had sent it to me and I was like, oh, this looks great. I'm just gonna see how this goes. To be fair though, I was actually an intern at EDF. I meant to mention this during the trajectory question, but it was like a decade earlier, at least, I think. So the person that I had worked with was not, part of this position that I was applying for, but I did kind of understand a little bit about the organization. So it wasn't totally cold, if you will. The other thing I did was I did kind of look at who was on the team that I was applying to and realized that there was a scientist, Emily Oldfield, whose papers I had read. I'd never met her, but I did reach out to her. I sent her an email and just said, can we chat about this? And that was really helpful, because like, we just built some trust and I got to know her and was like, she seems great. She seemed like a really fun person to work with. But I could ask her questions and kind of get a feel for what folks might be looking for in an applicant. So definitely recommend, reaching out to people. You may or may not get responses, but it can be really helpful in understanding, like, do you even want to apply to this position? And if so, how best to go about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't be afraid to reach out. And I think a lot of times we appreciate it when others do reach out to us. And if we don't have an opening, I we're happy to send them somewhere where we know there's an opening and try to match people based on their experience and their preferences and what they want versus what the opportunity offers.
Yeah, I did just mean to say also that I don't know about Woodwell, but EDF definitely has a job board on the website. So I'm not sure if there's a resource that collates all these types of jobs, but you can always just go directly, kind of check the website every once in a while if you know you're interested in an organization.
Yeah, we also have on our website an area that lists current openings. And doesn't hurt, that said, to reach out and let us know about you. And that way, when we have a position coming up, we can reach out to you directly and let you know there's this opportunity coming.
Yeah, that's great. I think you will be happy to hear that both pathways, a networking and a cold application, both can get you there. And so I think people will be happy to hear that. And maybe somewhat related to this of like starting these newer positions, I wonder, were there any skills you felt like you needed that you didn't have from your previous positions?
Hmm. I'm going to circle back to what Jocelyn said earlier. I felt like having a little bit more teaching experience would have been helpful for me. I have taught classes, but I think that the more you do it, the better that you're able to communicate to a broader audience. And that has been really important in my career. So trying to distill a lot of information down to something that's really short, snappy, and gets the point across. And um, yeah, I think communication skills and being able to teach and practice your communication in a teaching setting.
I actually had a hard time with this one. Like, I don't know. I think especially when I was applying, I was really trying to be like, what do I have to offer? So I had that kind of glass half full mindset. And I don't know that there were big skills that I felt like I was missing, but there was a lot of knowledge that like, it was a pretty big transition for me to come from my very narrow view, like really knowing one field very, very well, to this much broader space where like you're meant to know about methane and ice sheets and I don't know, like ocean currents and all these things like agricultural nitrous oxide emissions. And you'll talk about them all in the same day, and it can be really a lot to kind of remember and balance. So for me, there was a lot of just like general knowledge that I had to really come to terms with when I started the position. I don't know if I would say that's a skill, but it was like definitely the thing I noticed was missing the most.
I wonder if you all feel that you had to kind of address those knowledge gaps or skill gaps like when you were applying these positions and um, how you handled that. I think a lot of people had questions about, how do you translate these academic skills to these kinds of positions? And so I wonder if you all felt like you had to address that kind of head on when applying and interviewing for these positions.
For me, no, because they're very much looking for those academic skills, at least at our organization. It was more after I started the position that I think teaching and getting out and and sharing your message, sharing your knowledge with a diverse group of people earlier on helps build confidence. And so after I started the position, I kind of, well, I think Jocelyn, you touched on it a little bit. I kind of felt like an imposter in a way that here, I'm this new postdoc and suddenly I'm in a position where I need to communicate a lot of information about a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I was like, who am I to do that? But that's the reality of growing in a position, growing as a scientist, that tasked to do that more and more. And it just took a little bit longer for me, I think, to feel like, yeah, I am a scientist. I do have this knowledge. I do have this training. And I'm supposed to be here.
Yeah, I agree. It was something that I learned on the job, and I think that's totally okay. Like Jenny was saying, in these positions, I think you really are hired for your expertise and the skills that you have, which is great. And then it's kind of up to you how you respond to the position that you're put in and how much you want to grow. And like Jenny was saying, imposter syndrome is a total thing. I think it's just natural, right? Just the same as growing, right? Like you were saying. So I think a lot of us feel like imposters, but that kind of means that you're in a space where you're being challenged and you're growing, and that's great. So yeah, it was like on the job training for me for sure.
Yeah, I think that's great to hear. I feel like folks, I don't know, I feel like in other sectors, sometimes on-the-job training is expected and sometimes it's not in some ways, and in academia or NGOs, and I think it's okay to accept that's part of the job is training in the job. So I think it's good to hear for folks.
And at the
Um,
same time, to be okay that you don't know everything because you know where to find information. And that's a big part of it. If I don't know something, I know where to look.
yeah, that's a great point, Jenny. Yeah. We've had a few questions about kind of trainees at NGOs and whether you all feel your organizations tend to hire interns and like tend to keep folks around who have been in the organization previously. So maybe you all could speak to that.
At Woodwell, we do hire interns. We don't necessarily have a lot of openings every year, but we do have them. And I think as interns, you can come in with some of the skills you've learned about statistics and ecosystems and really have that hands-on experience where you're applying those learned skills in an academic setting in a real world situation. Science that's going to lead to reports, that's going to lead to publications and maybe impact policy. We and as someone grows, if it's a good fit for them, of course we encourage them to go get advanced degrees, but welcome them if a position opens. We love bringing back people who have prior knowledge and prior experience with our organization.
Yeah, we're very similar. I would say it isn't an established clear pipeline. So it's not like if you get an internship, you're likely to stay on. Most interns do leave. A lot of them are still in their undergrad or maybe, master. So they're still going to continue their education, like Jenny was saying. And so it is more like we hope that the interns get awesome experience. And ideally in the future, if a position opens up, we'll bring them back. But it's not like the normal pipeline, I would say, unfortunately. And it's just the nature of there aren't that many open positions, especially science positions. They come along kind of here and there, but we don't want to guarantee anybody anything because we never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think maybe related to this kind of pipeline question, there was one question about postdocs at these kind of nonprofit organizations versus at a university organization, since we have you both happen to have a postdoc at a university versus at an NGO, maybe you all can speak individually to how you perceive those to be different from one another.
For me, I felt like going through a postdoc at an NGO, at a research organization, gave me a lot more experience in proposal writing and working with foundations and big groups than I would have had in an academic setting. And it was more an opportunity for me to learn about project management and to get those foundational skills in leadership a lot of training opportunities for leadership here at Woodwell, and probably other NGOs offer the same, where I feel like in an academic setting, you're maybe working under somebody, maybe there aren't as many opportunities for you to expand your own research, and training maybe is not as accessible.
Yeah, I don't, I think it's pretty varied, I would say, in terms of the postdoc experience here. Similar to what Jenny's saying, it does kind of depend a lot on who you're working under, or if you're working for yourself. There are some positions that I think are more akin to maybe what Jenny experienced. But I would say here, the one thing I have noticed with postdocs that I've spoken to and worked with is it can be a little bit harder, I think, to maybe network and expand their networks because a lot of folks are remote. So that's like a sort of an extra, I won't say barrier necessarily, but it's just something that they have to consider and sort of work around. So we do have programs where we bring postdocs together, and we have different mentoring programs where postdocs can mentor folks under them, and they're mentored by someone above them. But it is, I think, a different world than maybe like being in an academic department where you're around people all the time. And the other thing is that I think a lot of postdocs here, they are working on, basic research a lot of the time, but then there's a really big applied side. So a lot of them are learning about the policy that's relevant to their work, or maybe a market mechanism that they're kind of feeding their science into. So that side I think is really nice, because there's that added element of some application that, a lot of postdocs might go into that field maybe instead of academia afterwards, because they've gotten that exposure. So hopefully that's clear. I don't know.
I do think it's really important for postdocs to have access to mentors. And then even before you get into the postdoc, as a PhD student, being able to grow your network and have those one-on-one mentors who can guide you in your pathway, because they have the experience. Typically, when you have that mentor relationship, that your mentor is someone more senior, more advanced in your field, and they have a lot of knowledge, and they know a lot of people, and they can help direct you and think about situations. They can tell you if that's a good fit, and maybe there's things that you need to consider that they're aware of, and you aren't.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Um, so you guys touched on two of our kind of remaining questions. So maybe quickly we can talk about working remotely. I believe you both work remotely, if I remember correctly. And so maybe you can both talk about the ability to work remotely, and whether that is maybe, I don't know, that that's related to the fact of your NGO, or it's a personal circumstance for you all. So you could just briefly talk about your ability to work remotely.
So when I started at Woodwell, it was not remote work friendly. So I'm calling in from Bozeman, Montana. This is where I live, and I love the mountains. This was my personal decision to live in a place that I have family nearby, and I can get to a trailhead pretty quickly. I had to pave my way to be able to do this. It wasn't something that was offered to me, and I had to really fight for it. But that was, I think, at a time where I had to really consider work-life balance. What was important to me? What are my values? What am I willing to give up or compromise on? And areas I'm just not. Fortunately, I was able to negotiate really hard and get this remote position. I did start out as hybrid, so I was going out to the East Coast of Massachusetts quite often in the initial years. And I do think that was important, because it helped me build those one-on-one relationships with people at the center. And I was able to really learn more and be integrated into our organization. And that opened the doors for me to stay and really have a place in leadership at the center. I think that if I had not had that one-on-one time, it probably would have looked really different how my career trajectory went. A lot of the people who work for me, if they're not working in a soils lab or environmental lab at our center, they are remote. We try to get together as often as we can through personal meetings, conferences, and our organization is getting better about bringing everyone in for staff meetings. in development at least once a year.
Yeah, I think EDF has been, I don't know if friendly is too strong a word, but definitely supportive of remote work for some time, just because of the nature of the organization, having offices around the world, remote, like remote meetings and those kinds of things have been a part of it for a long time. So especially during the pandemic, pretty much all the positions that were hired were full remote. And I would say that's not going away entirely. It's moving back towards hybrid work. But I think there's definitely an understanding that it's good for people to have that option. There's reasons why someone might really do better in a remote setting. So we are trying to maintain that as an option in a lot of cases. And there's some cases where, remote work really isn't an option if you're working with local communities on the ground, or if, there's a really big in-person component to what you do. But in general, I'd say ADF is pretty friendly toward remote work and does a pretty good job of making sure that people stay in touch and have many methods of kind of working together in remote settings, which is nice.
Yeah, I think it's great. That seems like it's an option. And maybe to kind of summarize what you all said, it probably depends on what your focus is. So if you're a hardcore lab scientist, then maybe remote is not as likely. But if you do other things, then maybe it's more likely. Okay, looks like we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. So one that I think would be a great one to talk about is about policy engagement. You both have mentioned policy a few times, and someone is asking, as an NGO, how much weight do you have in policy? How much you contribute to policy and policymakers? And then kind of finally, do you think it's important to have a PhD for this kind of policy relevant science?
And our organization, we are smaller. So I think that overall as an organization, my guess would be about 20 to 25% of our focus is on policy, not giving up the fundamental science that's happening at the center, but just using this as an opportunity to take that science and that information and directly plug it into policy. So we do have, I believe, a full-time lobbyist that connects us with opportunities in DC. We go to a lot of global climate-focused policy meetings, and we have DC fly-ins, which is an amazing opportunity for scientists to go talk to our senators and our representatives and talk about certain science issues that are impacting people in the US and globally. So those opportunities I think are really important. And one of the reasons I really enjoy working at Woodwell Climate, because I feel like my science, it doesn't end at that publication. It can go further. It can go directly and help educate and provide decision makers with the information they need to make informed decisions.
That's so cool. I want to do a DC fly-in. We're pretty similar here, but I think again, because we're a large organization, it's maybe a bit separate is maybe not the right word, but we have definitely, I'd say, folks who are more dedicated. They are just policy people, like the lobbyist Jenny mentioned. And then the scientists, like we meet with them on a pretty regular basis, at least weekly, I would say, to just understand what's going on in the policy space and how the science fits in. But I don't do that directly, if that makes sense. So like I don't meet with policymakers unless there was maybe a topic that was very specific to the work I do. Maybe they would let me come, but normally that's sort of in the policy realm, and there are folks who work on that specifically, and we collaborate more within the organization to try and get those messages out to the right places. But definitely policy is a huge, huge lever that EDF works on and tries to influence all the time.
And in working with people who do focus on policy, that's not something I focus on. I work with people who help me make that transition. So I give them the information and then they help with the policy piece. Those having a solid background in environmental science, I think is fundamental. And then at some point, I felt I feel like the ones I really work well with are the ones who at some point in their career transition to policy. So they know the science, but then they also know how policy works.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then maybe one of you could speak to, if you know, like kind of like the level of education needed for these kinds of positions. Like, are PhDs kind of required, or do you see that there's other kind of education pathways to get there?
Most often I see PhD level, but there may be other opportunities.
For this question is specifically for the folks who work in policy at the organization.
I guess like kind of science policy spanners, if there are those kinds of folks at the organization.
Yeah, I agree that would probably be PhD, although I'd say like most of the folks I know who work on policy definitely are not. Like most of them I don't even, maybe they have like a master's, but it would be in policy. There are some PhDs, but I would say like the really hardcore policy folks are not.
Yeah, so perhaps it depends on if you want to be more of a spanner or more of a
Yeah.
strictly policy kind of person. Okay, so let's do one more question. We have one left in the chat, so we'll get it done before we go to breakout rooms. Someone has asked, what are the career options for you all moving forward from your current positions? If you're looking to, I guess, advance or move forward or change careers, like what are those options for you all?
I can go first. I see myself staying at Woodwell. When you get to this position at this level of seniority as a scientist, I think that a lot of doors are open and available to you. We could transition over to being an academic setting again, because we're still very much focused on science. That said, I think it's just personal preference and what you feel like is a really good fit to you. And if something is working well and you're building programs, you're less likely to want to leave.
Yeah, I agree. I really love this sector and hope to stay in it. And just like in a more specific vein, the sort of career ladder as a scientist at EDF, I think Jenny mentioned this too. There are different paths. You can take a path that does kind of go more toward management and mentorship, and those kinds of activities, or you can stay on the very, what I would say like hardcore science path. You don't necessarily have to manage someone to move up in the ranks and be promoted, which I think is really nice. So we have a little bit of flexibility there, and it isn't necessarily assumed that you have to take one particular pathway to advance in your career if you want to stay at the organization. But agree with everything that Jenny said. I think we still have some flexibility, and I think there might be that fear that if you leave academia, you can't go back, but I don't think that's the case. And I think a lot of times having that sort of external experience and knowledge of how the system works can be very helpful if you do want to go back.
I'm sure that'll be very soothing for lots of people to hear who are scared of making the leap out of academia, myself included. So I will end this portion of the workshop. I thank you so much, Jocelyn and Jenny, for all of your amazing insights. So now you will have these breakout rooms where you are sorry, you have the option to either jump in a breakout room with Jocelyn or Jenny, or you can switch between them if you want, and chat about specifically EDF or Woodwell, and their experiences there. And so I think we were the breakout rooms open.
Yes, please give me some time to create the breakout rooms.
Okay, yeah. So we'll start those breakout rooms in just a second. And I'll say that those of you who were hoping to learn about the UN Environment Program with Diana, unfortunately, she's had a flight delay and is unable to join this. And so she will not be available for meeting, but Jocelyn and Jenny will be. And we'll give Woo just a second. Oh, okay. It looks like they're open. So how about Jocelyn, you go in. Oh no, sorry, they're labeled. Okay, great. So join whatever labeled room you would like to join, and then I will stay here in case any folks have issues and want to come back to the main room. And so we'll do that until 10:30 Mountain or 12:30 Eastern.